moving to ideas, I see. But let me once more turn to the audience.
Is the Fiscal Treaty a threat or an opportunity? And with the treaties that we have nowadays in Europe, can we believe in growth and in creating new jobs?
The Fiscal Treaty is not the single solution, but it's part of the solution and not part of the problem.
I would imagine that it's both, depending a little on how it's going to be implemented. What I think is quite clear is that it is insufficient, because it's only, as we have already heard here, only part of the problems which are, have to do with sovereign over-indebtedness. In other countries, it's really a question of the private sector being too indebted. Of course, in other countries, in still other countries, there is a question of competitiveness and growth being too low. And the Fiscal Treaty won't really address those issues. So I would imagine that the first question after the Fiscal Treaty is accepted is, what will we need more? It will be issues which really, I would imagine, enlarge the powers of the financial supervisor, and which argue very strongly for tax harmonization and wage harmonization.
To Dr. McCarthy, you said years ago that it wasn't a liquidity crisis the banks had, it was a real financial solvency crisis. Is it possible that the same mistakes could be made by the banks again in another 15 years when they get out of this?
It's clear that that is true at European level, and to feed liquidity to banks that have a solvency problem is to give a misdiagnosed patient the wrong medicine, and eventually it has to be addressed. The problem is being exacerbated now through loading the obligation to bail out bank bondholders onto the balance sheets of states, and of course the sovereign bondholders end up in effect paying for the bank bondholders, and this ultimately is not sustainable either.
Is the time now to amend the ECB's mandate to give it equal weighting, that it would have a mandate for growth as well as for price stability?
Expanding the mandate to include unemployment or growth or whatever, a mandate perhaps more like the Federal Reserve Board's mandate in the United States, requires a change in policy and treaty changes and ECB statute changes and so on. A change in the rule about monetary financing of governments would equally require treaty change. Those kind of issues just have to be addressed, it seems to me. There's also an issue about ECB accountability. After, I think it's a delay of 3 weeks in the case of the Federal Reserve Board and 2 weeks in the case of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, you can read the minutes of the meeting on their websites, and you can read who voted for an interest rate increase and who voted against. The ECB does not release minutes of its meetings. You can't find out who voted what way. They will eventually release the archives in 30 years, apparently. They hold a press conference after each of their fortnightly meetings, at which they issue statements that were clearly prepared before the meeting started. So there's a real accountability problem.
It's not a question, just an invitation for comment on an article written by Paul Krugman in the New York Times last Monday. The article had 500 responses last night, and in the title of it was Europe's Economic Suicide. The last paragraph is, "So it's hard to avoid a sense of despair. Rather than admit they've been wrong, European leaders seem determined to drive their economy and their society off a cliff, and the whole world will pay the price." And one of the responses to the article says, "We face perhaps the largest test of non-violence that we have ever faced. How far can the powerless be pushed? The corporation has made power amorphous. How does one rebel against a bank?"
As Krugman is absolutely convinced that more stimulus is necessary. Other people are equally convinced that austerity is the way back to growth. And in fact, one of the editorial board members of this organization only this week, the Finnish Europe minister, said austerity first. Austerity is the only way back to growth. Personally, I don't understand how people can be so certain about these things. The evidence is just not there. Krugman just cannot say that austerity doesn't work. It's worked in the Baltics. All three Baltic countries went through more severe austerity than any of the Western European countries, and now they're growing again. It doesn't seem to be working in Southern Europe. I just don't see how people can be so certain about which policy is right and which policy is wrong, because we just don't have the evidence base to make those assertions. So it seems to me that we're very much, and policymakers have very much been in uncharted territory since this crisis broke out and are making it up as they go along.